last week's episode, we talked about this article I'd written for the Daily Beast about the leaks. I took, the position you'd expect me to take. But apparently a lot of Daily Beast readers were not expected to read, which is that leaks are good. We should know what our government's foreign policy is. And yes, more leaks, please. I was invited to come talk about it on Rising, and it was good. It was a good interview. I think it was a fair interview. I think there was a little bit of disagreement. Nobody called anybody, America-hating scum or anything. But I want to just play that, spend like a minute kind of talking about the one disagreement that did kind of come up, and then we're going to go to Victor and Ethan.
While authorities and mainstream media alike have been quick to demonize the Pentagon leaker, 21-year-old National Air Guardsman Jack Teixeira, our next guest argues, says we should see him as a public service hero. Writer Ben Burgis contends the central question around the leaked documents is not how Airman Teixeira had access, but why were these secrets kept from the public in the first place?
On revelations around the Ukraine war, Burgis writes, quote, "It's also important information from the perspective of Americans who should get a say in how deeply our own country should be involved in that war." Ben Burgis, a columnist at Jacobin and host of Give Them an Argument, joins us now to discuss. Welcome, Ben.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And you're making an argument that I myself have made on this show. The overclassification of supposedly sensitive documents is such an issue. It's a lack of transparency. It's the government shielding from people things we ought to know. Looking at these documents and give me your impression, it actually doesn't seem like a lot of the truly defensively sensitive material, the locations of troop movements, the identities of spies who might be embedded in foreign countries, but rather just intelligence about the general situation Ukraine is in, which is something the American people ought to know as we make our decisions about whether to continue supporting what our government is doing with respect to military support.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of what emerged from this is extremely relevant to these public policy questions about how much or how long the United States should continue its present course of amping up military support to Ukraine and not making any effort at de-escalation or peace negotiations. Certainly, for example, the information that Ukrainian President Zelensky wants to use longer-range missiles for strikes within Russia is pretty important to the debate about whether such missiles should be sent to Ukraine, or in general how much current support should be amped up. And I think probably the most disturbing thing in these documents is the revelation, and there were previous reports of it, but certainly nothing that was admitted, that there are NATO boots on the ground, including American boots on the ground. Not very many of them, but there are a few on the ground in Ukraine, which is something that President Biden specifically promised last year in an op-ed in the New York Times that he would not do. And to my mind, the real question here is, should the rest of us have a say on that? In other words, this is, whether or not to send the special forces personnel to Ukraine, that seems like a really important foreign policy question. And it's one that shouldn't be made in secret from the American public.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you're focusing in here and also in your article about the substance of the leaked documents that, to your point, have gone largely undercovered by mainstream media sources who have instead focused on the provenance of the documents and how this Air Guard figure was able to access them and put them on Discord without them being caught. That being said, it seems to me that a lot of the pushback here is about the hypocrisy that the mainstream media is more interested in the leaker than the substance of the documents. And the argument goes, this is they're carrying water for the state. They are refusing to report on material information here. They've been very hypocritical about leakers in the past. But is it possible to both have a journalistic interest in the provenance of the documents and simultaneously report on the substance of the documents? Or do you agree with Glenn Greenwald, who has argued that there's something inappropriate about the choice of mainstream media reporters to really hunt down and reveal the identity of the source?
Yeah, I do agree with Glenn on that one. I think that it's disturbing to focus on trying to find out who leaked these documents. I mean, that it's one thing to say that as information comes up, you're going to report it. You're not going to hold it back, because it's newsworthy. But to the extent that some mainstream media sources, Washington Post, New York Times, seem to be really on a mission to find out who this was, to essentially help the national, the security state, the Pentagon, to track down and arrest this person for the crime of exposing this information, perhaps inadvertently, right? If that wasn't his goal, I don't care very much about his goals, but what he was being hunted down for was exposing this information to the American public, and I think that the media should want that information to be exposed to the American public. And certainly, like to the extent that some of what's gone on stepped over the line from just being like, well, here's what we know so far about the search for this guy, to let's actively try to figure out who this was, then yes, that does disturb me. I think that's very different from the attitude that I would hope that an independent media would have towards leakers.
Well, yeah, and I wonder if it reflects a kind of ideology of the mainstream media that is really even clearer in this conflict, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, than past conflicts, where there's not a lot of, despite these publications being progressive in a lot of ways on social issues and other things, they're the kind of capture of the Democratic Party by national security officials. They're the more, at the present time, kind of the mainstream Democratic Party and mainstream media are the more, in some kind of weird twist, the more hawkish of the factions, even though there's, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of hawkishness in Republican circles as well, but they're almost even more bought into this conflict on the idea that we need to fund it perpetually than I think the media might have been before, which means that, what this leaker is doing is almost substantively bad, in addition to like the journalism questions of whether they should, pursue leads and that kind of thing from their perspective.
Yeah. So, I mean, the part that I would very slightly push back on is just the comparative question. I do think that, at least in a sort of broad sense, if you look at their views, not just on Russia and Ukraine, but other areas, especially China, I think even a lot of very sort of mega populisty Republicans are actually sort of super hawkish on that. It's almost like the old Obama thing about how the war in Iraq was bad because it's distracted us from Afghanistan. Sometimes, what people are really saying is, the war in Ukraine is bad because it distracts us from the confrontation with China. But putting that aside, I mean, I agree with the rest of that. I think that the Democratic Party certainly is very, invested in American empire. I don't think that's particularly, new development. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the way that most Democrats acted about the Iraq and Afghanistan wars when they started, and the Patriot Act and all of that. But it is a real phenomenon, and certainly a lot of news organizations share that worldview. That they, again, the concern, and this is what really bothers me when I look at the story, that the concern is not, wow, this is amazing information that has been kept from our readers, and it would be obviously relevant if you accept the basic premise that in a democracy, the public in general should get to know what the country's foreign policy is in detail. I'm not talking about troop movements, but I am talking about things like whether to send special forces personnel to Ukraine in the first place, questions like what the likely consequences would be of escalating American military aid, being it passed down where it is. These are questions of vital public importance that citizens of a democracy should get to weigh in on. And rather than seeing their role as to help spread this information to their readers, viewers, listeners, I am disturbed by how many media outlets seem to think, that the most important thing for them to do is to press the Pentagon on what they see as the scandal of how a 24-year-old National Guard airman could have gotten access to this information in the first place.
Yeah, I guess it just doesn't seem to me that one of those follows from the other. Like, of course, it is annoying. It is inappropriate. It is a dereliction of their journalistic responsibility to focus on the provenance of the documents to the exclusion of the substance of the documents. But I do think that there is a credible argument about this person not actually being a leaker. He hasn't described himself as a leaker. We'll find out more about his motives, I'm sure, in the future. But he is not someone who would be incentivized to continue to leak information to journalists by protecting his identity, right? The rationale of protecting your sources is to facilitate them being able to share material public information so that it can be reported on for the public interest, which of course is deeply important. It's not clear to me how that plays into a figure like Airman Teixeira, given that his motivation, as we know it, to share this information was not for the public interest, not to share with journalists, et cetera, but to impress people in his Discord group. And that being the case, what value, is there an obligation actually for journalists to continue to protect his identity? Not that they should vindictively try to expose him because he didn't share the information with him. But is it correct to refer to him as a leaker? And is it correct for him to then expect the same kind of expectations in terms of protection from the from journalists rather, given the way he has chosen to behave? Do we want to incentivize this behavior, leaking to Discord, or do we want to incentivize leaking to journalists? I'll give you a chance to respond.
Yeah. So obviously it would have been better if he'd leaked directly to journalists. I understand the argument that he doesn't count as a leaker. I will say I don't have that much interest in that argument. I think that the sort of key question is whether we have a right to know this information and what role the media plays in that process. And rather than kind of the moral virtue of this guy. Now, I understand your argument that the standard reasons for protecting leakers don't apply to him because it may be true that he only did this inadvertently. This wasn't really his motive. But I guess where I would get off board with that argument is that my concern would be not just incentivizing him personally to continue to leak more information, but incentivizing or at least not providing a massive disincentive to the next person and the person after that and the person after that to leak important information. Because I think if I were in this guy's position and even if I had better motivations than him, I would see what was happening to him. I would see the Washington Post say that it was a despicable dereliction of duty, what he said. I would say organizations like the Post and the Times collaborating with Bellingcat apparently to help track him down. And none of that would make me confident that they were going to have a different attitude towards me, even if I did this in a different way. In other words, if I was confident that Robbie was wrong and this doesn't reflect a sort of ideological conviction on the part of media, I might understand that argument a little bit better. I might be able to say, okay, maybe everybody would know that their attitude would be different, for somebody who acted more like a standard leaker. In this case, I'm much less confident that that's true.
And of course, there's a middle ground. It would be better, I think, if he leaked to journalists, but a trusted journalist, not necessarily someone who manufactures the same mainstream consensus.
That's the incentive that will be set up. Arguably, he could be looking at this and saying, "Oh, next time I should leak to a journalist."
Well, more. Thank you, Ben.
I hope so.
Thank you so much for joining us.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and I guess two quick points about this before we wrap it up. One of them is I was talking to Bronco March-Teach about this later, and I think he made a good point, which is that leaker is actually a totally neutral term. It's just somebody who leaks information. There's the maybe you don't want to call him a whistleblower because that's something that suggests a certain motive, but that you're still a leaker regardless of why you leaked it. But that's a semantic point that doesn't really matter. And my whole thing is that I think sort of obsessing about honestly my one regret about the Daily Beast, articles. They put the word hero in the headline. I don't think it appears in the article because I don't care about that, right? I don't care whether he's a good guy or a bad guy or, what his level of personal virtue is. I care about whether the public has a right to know this information, and I care about whether the media should be helping the government drag him down. And I'm yes on one, and therefore no on two. And I guess where Briahna's argument there doesn't make sense to me is that the idea that this creates an incentive to leak to journalists, I just don't see it. I think that I don't see anything about the sort of zeal of the mainstream press to expose this guy that even vaguely hints that of course we'd be going to jail to defend him if he'd leaked it to us. Right. I can't imagine anybody in that position concluding that. It's, when the Washington Post editorializes and called a disgusted dereliction of duty that he leaked this stuff to the Discord server. And in fact, the Washington Post seems to be interested in helping to expose who it is. I mean, not only did they not say, but of course we would be dying, throwing our lives down to defend him had he leaked it directly to us and not to a Discord server. Not only do they not say that, I just don't see any world in which anybody inside the military who might otherwise be considering leaking would somehow read between the lines that, that was the incentive they were created.
I mean, there's no difference between what's going on right now with this leaker and Edward Snowden. If you remember back then, I actually was watching Melissa Harris Perry, and she's sitting there she did this segment on like how egocentric Edward Snowden was, and I literally just turned off my TV. Well, actually, no. First, I deleted it from my my TiVo. And like all her future episodes, and I'm like, no, I read her book and I liked her book, so that's why I watched her show, and like she said that, and I'm like, nope, this isn't right. We're not a pair. We can't see each other anymore. I'm gonna have to delete you from my TiVo. Yeah, and I don't see any difference between then where he actually did leak to a journalist, to now.
Yeah. And also whatever. I mean, if somebody let's say he'd done neither what he did nor leaked to a journalist, but he just put it all up as a Medium post. Right? So there's no journalist involved unless you want to say by virtue of posting on Medium, he's a journalist, which is, I guess cutting the argument very thin, but but yeah. I mean, I think that if you want to have this stuff to be able to report on, you don't want to give people the impression that you're going to be on the side of the people trying to track them down if they expose it, and I think try to make this very fine distinction, about different ways of exposing it or how. I mean, I really don't see anybody who didn't go to law school concluding it's they only did this because we didn't leak it to them. And frankly, even a lot of people who did, I think would reasonably suspect that nothing about the attitude that was displayed by the press when this happened gives them confidence that they would protect leakers even then. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.